Happy Sunday. We're going to start by discussing a few things that I've encountered lately. We call it Sundays with Stories. We usually tell stories about people who other people know so that we're all sort of in the same ballpark. But I'm going to tell a few stories that are apropos our last discussion about community and then go from there. And hopefully they're as relatable as I think they might be.
I lose track sometimes of which channel we're on and what event has been posted, but we talked about how the modern tendency is to discard community in favor of professional help.
Right.
Because actually, the loss of community is a major source of the problems, and our increasing reliance on outside help, quote expert help, medicalized very often, is in fact at the base root of our ever increasing problems. So that was one of our last podcasts. And now you had kind of a chance, as you often do, you're enmeshed in a number of communities. It's one of your great strengths. And you live in a place, as I keep sending you emails, that's described as one of the great communities in the United States. I don't know, am I allowed to mention? South Burlington was listed in this, I get these lists, as the least stressful environment in the municipal environment in the United States. I said, oh, for God's sake, I mean, there's 10 billion communities. So kudos to you for living there, but I don't think you're the source of everything, but maybe you're doing a bit to reduce the stress in South Burlington. But now you've taken your show on the road a little bit, but as you know, you do that through LPP. Of course, you're talking to people around the world. So you were dealing with a family matter or a funeral.
Yeah, and I was hesitant to say anything last time we spoke because nothing had been talked about, or I didn't know what state the family was in, but I can say now, I'll even say his name. My cousin's name was Josh Rhodes, and my family generally isn't as connected as we could be. And my cousin Josh has always keyed into that, and he wished that we were. And he always kept in touch. He lives in Pennsylvania. I'm in Vermont, so it's not like it's that far away. It took us 8 hours to drive down there. I mean, you got to plan the trip, but it's not like it's so far away that we had a good excuse to be estranged from one another. And he went out of his way to give me encouragement for my accomplishments. I mean, he was keeping track of everything that I did, and he would message me. I think somebody at the funeral even mentioned that he did his best thinking at night. So he would message me at 1 a.m. saying, hey, I read this article that you wrote, and here's what I think about it. And wow, what good work you're doing. And he had great things to say about everybody. So it shouldn't have taken a tragedy to realize what I realized as I went down there. But I'm happy that we did. We all got together, our family and from all different states got together, and we sort of promised each other, let's not let that much time pass again before we get together.
That you were at the funeral of Josh. Is that I don't know.
Right. So we went down I drove down for Josh's funeral, and actually they called it a celebration of life, which is what he would have wanted. So it was like his favorite food was pizza. We all ate pizza and told stories about our relationships with him. Why I'm saying this is that you might think, a death of a family member is a traumatic experience. I mean, if trauma means anything, I mean, I don't know what is more traumatic, especially, I was with my uncle, his father, and his mother and his sister, we called them twins, even though they're years apart, but they were very in tune to each other. And that's a tragic event. And what I thought was remarkable about how they dealt with it is that they had continued celebrations, get-togethers, told stories, and I could just see it was just so evident how everyone was holding each other up. I mean, adults to kids, adults to adults when those adults ran out of bandwidth to take care of kids, and then switched roles, had each other's backs. I heard stories about how everyone helped each other get through it. And I guess all I want to say about that is that I don't feel worried that my family's going to get stuck in the trauma cyclone. I feel like all of his direct family members, his sister, his parents, his nephews, nieces, friends, they feel this is tragic. And you can, slowly, as you know, with a death of a family member or a friend, you start going around your normal life, and wherever that person had a place in your life, you find kind of a void or reminded. And it seems like each time that's happening, that there's another family member or community member to call on. There were people there. My cousin Josh he was a sound engineer, so he worked at all these different music venues. And there were people there that spoke who mentioned, we don't really know your family very well, but we knew Josh. And so his family is important to us. So we just want to know that down the road, we're having a charity event. So we're going to have all these different musicians and bands play there. And every single dollar we make, we're donating to the family. He left a child behind, his son behind. And it was remarkably sad to see. I mean, he's 3 years old. And so there'd be pictures of him popping up at this funeral. And there's a 3-year-old trying to understand what's going on. And so you'd see pictures, say, Dad. And so you could tell that there's something there that needed to be dealt with. And everyone just gathered around this kid to do their best to help him make sense of things, be okay, raise him. None of it's enviable. It was terrible. It was a sad weekend, and yet I felt completely uplifted by the camaraderie, sense of family, and sense of community that was there. So I couldn't help thinking as I left, we had done a podcast about, as you say, community being ameliorative for all sorts of things. And community in this case was and still is, and I think continue to be ameliorative in terms of coping with the loss of a family member and community member who it meant a lot to everybody. What I'm trying to say is that sort of flies in the face of trauma theorists. It's not a perfect argument. And you might even say, well, isn't that nice? All of you privileged people have the community and capacity to do all this stuff. And then again, and that is sort of what we're talking about, is that for people who have less privilege and less access to those kinds of resources, the answer isn't to designate a label or ongoing, pathologizing of their state of mind. It's to help them enhance their sense of community and their sense of purpose and togetherness and family and things like that.
And you can't outsource it. You can't say, oh, they don't have a community. Let's send them someplace else where they'll get help. But then they're going to go back to where they live. They're not moving.
Right.
So when Nora Volko goes to Kensington and Philadelphia, everybody there says, we need community resources. And she goes, really? I've been head of the NIDA for 2 decades. I never knew that. I thought that we could just treat people for addiction.
And it's tempting, though, to say, well, you could do that. Like if for somebody who really has none of the resources, maybe there is something medical or therapeutic that's a proxy for community. That's very tempting. It's like you can offer people something like some sort of a Band-Aid, and maybe that's the best that they'll get. My issue with that, and I'm certain yours too, is that aren't you putting a ceiling on their ability to be able to produce some of that community or experience some of that community down the line? People change and their circumstances change, but they won't change for the better if you apply the label, apply the treatment, apply the, whatever it is, that Band-Aid to them forever and tell them that's the best it gets.
In other words, outsourcing is not just an alternative or a neutral option. It's something that deprives the community because you're not focusing on enhancing the community. You're discounting it, disregarding it, and not investing in it. And then you sort of, you're not permanently in treatment. Um, and that resource has now been depleted by the actual supposed helpful treatment.
So all I can say, and to put a cap on all of that, is that I'm not going to speak for my cousin who's not here to speak for himself, but I'm relatively certain that he would be absolutely tickled by the fact that an experience that he of him bringing people together, whether even though it was because of a tragedy, is not only bringing those people together, but is enhancing my work and outlook, which he always encouraged me to do and to continue doing. I think that brings things back full circle, and it's a pretty, I couldn't resist, talking about him and what I thought about this weekend.
I guess I had a theory. I've often had a theory. People have this experience sometimes when a person dies, and I always had the theory, why don't we move it forward to before they die?
Yeah, right.
I mean, I've seen a few episodes of this. One of the great events in my recent life was, I have an older friend, Alta Ann. She had a 90th birthday party, and she gathered people, from all around her life to celebrate it. And, just it was fabulous. And you were saying that Josh Rhodes would have really enjoyed this. It's too bad, well, you were regretting it yourself that we didn't do this before.
Right.
When Josh Rhodes would have enjoyed it.
The thing we all came away with, that's exactly it, this could happen to anyone at any time. So let's not wait for that to happen again before we celebrate each of our lives and accomplishments and, be able to talk to each other and get together. So, it's strongly, and I believe that, sometimes, I don't know if this has ever happened, you get together with people you haven't seen for a while and you say, well, let's do it again. Let's not wait. But then life happens. This time, I actually believe that everybody's making an effort. I think people are already making plans to get together in the next few months. And so I think that Josh lived that way anyway. He sort of celebrated everybody, everything, and himself. And you're right. It's just too bad that we didn't come together to do a celebration of life before the tragedy happened. Recently, I had a discussion with a child who's 5 years old. So I think he's either in kindergarten or is going to be starting kindergarten soon. And that 5-year-old had a family member who had an older family member who had difficulty with alcohol. And we were there at a party, and there were adults drinking. And this 5-year-old was hyper focused on what people were drinking. Hey, what is that you have? Is that beer or is that soda? And so come to find out, it's because he had been told that this family member had a difficulty drinking. He wondered, and some outcomes that were visible, he was explained, well, that's because of drinking. And so now he thought, well, I guess that means drinking just does that to everybody. So why is everybody drinking? And
people were talking to him about negative outcomes of drinking.
Right. So he was engaged with me and other people in this discussion about why adults were drinking if this is what happens. And so it was explained to him that, well, adults drink. It's some of the ways that adults are social. And so it's not inherently bad. It's just that if you have too much of it, if you start to drink instead of doing other fun things or interesting things in life, then you can get carried away with it, and then it can hurt. And the 5-year-old immediately understood that. He said, well, it's kind of like sugar. So it's like, so I'm like, I know that if I love cookies, I know that if I have too many, that I don't feel well. Plus, then I kind of can't go to gymnastics the next day because I'm not going to feel good or perform my best at gymnastics. It's like that, how common sense what we're saying is so common sense that a 5-year-old who's never thought about it immediately intuits the concept. I mean, it doesn't sound that crazy for for someone that young to interpret that and make the connection. Well, it's just like anything really, like whatever it is, sugar, soda, anything that I enjoy, but I'm not supposed to do too often. Sometimes the kid and his family eat out at restaurants, but they don't do it every night. And so why wouldn't they do it every night? A 5-year-old, it's so easy a 5-year-old could do it, is basically what I'm saying. And so I'm sure you'll have something to comment on about that. But
it's almost as though an understanding, well, we often say, well, one of our recent conversations was about the sociologist and alcoholism theorist who I got natural life processes idea from, Harold Mulford. He said, well, what if we never invented the concept of alcoholism? How would we deal with all of these things? And this is sort of an example. This is somebody who hasn't, at 5, gotten a lecture, the Dora Volko HBO special on addiction lecture about what addiction is. And he comes to grips with it as a natural process, that people are sometimes pulled into something that's appealing and they go so far into it that it's excessive and harmful, and that you need to learn how to balance things. And your comment, I remember by email, was you told him he actually understands addiction better than a lot of experts.
That's right. I mean, the adults were trying to think about, well, how do I explain this in a way that makes sense? And I think they were thinking, well, this is so complex that I don't understand it. So how do I break it down for a 5-year-old? When really they could have been thinking, this is so simple that it's actually nice that a 5-year-old's asking, because it'll be easy to lay the groundwork for an understanding, and it's a good learning opportunity. I find that with kids a lot. And in this case, I couldn't help but think about life process program, things that we talk about in addiction, and just, this will seem tangential, but I'll pull it back. I studied physics for a long time, and I was even writing about it. And I got to talk to a guy, Lawrence Krauss, who's, do you know about Lawrence Krauss? Does the Origins Project at Arizona State University. And he talked about a problem that physicists who are communicators of physics or science, they always try to blow people's minds, like with this super complicated stuff, and it almost sounds like magic. But when really what they should be doing, what he likes to do to his first-year students, is explaining it in all its boringness and all its detail, what this concept is and how you get there, so that people can actually map that knowledge onto something new, rather than learn later that everything they have to unlearn it and then do it again. That just reminded me of this, where you could have taught.
Sometimes they look for examples, like in the common world right around them, things that people know about.
Right.
As a good thing.
Right. So, but the thing about physics is that there is really counterintuitive stuff going on there that you have to eventually learn. So you have to figure out how to teach it and stretch that out and teach it in stepping stones. But in this case, it's a little bit different. Like the ultimate conclusion that a person should reach about what moderation is, or what alcohol does or doesn't do to you, is super common sense. You don't need to take it further than what that 5-year-old said. And so, onward.
So we did a blog post about dealing with why addiction can be hard to deal with. And that was a little bit tricky, because we're people who say you can outgrow addiction. So it seems as though we're saying, well, Bob's your uncle, anybody can deal with it. But obviously people who contact us at the Life Process Program are people who are having some kind of difficulty with it. And so we keyed off that to write a blog post about why is dealing with addiction so hard. Why don't you pick it up from there then?
So 3 things. One, people who are critics of our ideas will often say, fine, you win, 80 to 90% of people, whatever. Most people outgrow addiction. What about the people that don't? Aren't they in some sort of a different category? But then there are also, like you say, participants of our program, or people who are interested in it, who wonder, do we deal differently with people who are in worse circumstances, who seem like they have less hope or fewer resources or any of that stuff? But the thing that really sparked it was I was talking to one of our coaches, Dee Cloward, and she's actually been my coach as I participate in the Life Process program to try to get a handle on my health, eating, working out, regimen, kind of lifestyle stuff. And I am going to document some of my progress. And she asked me, do you think that in documenting your progress, people will relate? You just naturally relate. And I said, I think so. I mean, addiction is sort of addiction and the process is the same. And she helped me think about, well, what about those people who are asking those questions? What if you're in more dire circumstances? What if people aren't married, have a good job, enjoy music, live in a non-stressful place like South Burlington, Vermont, are worried about life and death at any moment? How can you discuss addiction with them? So that's why we wrote the article. And I suppose that the thesis of the whole thing was that there isn't a difference except in severity. We always talk about addiction as a sliding scale. The ingredients or the roadmap for combating addiction remains the same. The optimism that you can have could remain the same. And that's harm reduction. You kind of deal with either an individual or a community with their emergent needs and work those out so that they can map onto a process that can be lifelong. That's what the Life Process program means.
And in a way, it's cheating to say most people overcome addiction, because the average lifespan, the median point of quitting some addictions, smoking is the most enduring, is 24 years. And an alcohol dependence, 16, it's less, 6 and 5 for cocaine and marijuana. But who wants to, smoke for 24 years? So
right. It's
cheating to say, well, if you look at people's lives, most people will quit addictions on their own. And then somebody might say, well, who needs you? And so we want to do two things. We want to lay out a roadmap. We understand how people progress, often in the natural way, through overcoming addiction. And we can be a resource for doing that. But we don't want to, in presenting our help, remove from the person, create in the person a feeling of dependence, either on us or on the addiction. We don't call them addictions. We have discussions about people's problems. And the last thing that we want to do is to convince people that they have a lifelong addictive problem. We want to talk instead, refocus on all of the changes that we're helping them to make or that they're making on their own, which point them in a positive direction. It's incremental. It's like you say, ongoing throughout their lives. And it's a matter of conveying agency, that it's about them and what it is that they're going to be doing.
You mentioned, like, my cousin Josh, there was a celebration of life and everyone got together and he would have loved this. And you thought, geez, you wish that he could have been around to see all of that. So is there a way for families, for communities to do those kinds of celebrations ahead of time? And some cultures have those kinds of celebrations. Similarly, we're sort of asking, instead of waiting for a heart attack or whatever it is to get you to stop doing whatever drug or alcohol or, whatever you're tied up in, is there a way to take on whatever that realization or revelation will be when that happens? Is there a way to actually put that front and center now? That's the whole outgrowing thing. Most people do outgrow it, but it takes some either gradual life changes or some event that people become aware, a little bit more aware and mindful in life. How can we bring that mindfulness front and center? And if that expedites the process for people who may have outgrown it anyway, there's no logical reason why that wouldn't work, to try to get that sort of more mindful attitude, more pro-conscious living and enjoying life attitude to people who have worse circumstances. It's just that it's idiosyncratic outcomes for our broad roadmap.
And we want, and you've made helped to make me understand the optimism and hopefulness linkage to Martin Seligman's work. We don't want people to come in. I mean, Nora Volkow had this famous meme: addiction is a disease of free will. The most important thing is for a person not to ever be discouraged, to appreciate whatever changes they are making, give them a greater sense of self-control. For example, people originally thought that a needle exchange, the anti-needle exchange people would say, well, look, you're encouraging their addiction. But in fact, the better way to look at it is they're finally taking a step to help themselves. They're saying, well, look, I'm doing something that's improving my health. I'm, still maybe injecting drugs, but look, I've got some control over my health and my habit. And, that could be a progressive thing. Well, okay, maybe I don't need to inject drugs, or I can take them in a more controlled manner, and I can improve other aspects of my life.
So in a way, harm reductionists should know this more than anybody. Your drug policy advocates should understand this better than anyone, that you have people in some of the worst circumstances. That's almost like you want to apply our model more so. You should more want to apply our model, because rather than saying, well, you're beyond help, that you should just be stuck in this treatment center, or you should be given this pill, or whatever it is, you're saying, why don't we figure out how you can take control of some of this and, make choices for yourself.
And then not the gradual path, the progression of control in their lives.
Right.
So we had a question about porn addiction. You wanted to also introduce a listener question. I think I understand.
Yeah, this is remarkably, there are several people that I'm working with right now, who will all think I'm talking about them. Only one of them asked the question, and I have permission to share the question. In a really similar circumstance. So they're all young men, and it's either because of restrictions from COVID or injuries, or for some reason, they're in their houses more often and not around other people as often as they would normally be. And so the question, I don't have the wording in front of me, but basically the question is, I've developed this relationship with pornography that I've never had before. I think it's turned into an addiction. So should I be worried that I'm not going to be able to kick this thing? Of course, we just described why the person could not be worried that they'll never kick the thing, or some of the ways they might think differently about the problem, other than it's all encompassing. You seem like you're about to say something.
It's funny. Are there any positive sides to people's reference or use of porn during the pandemic? Are there ways to balance the negative and the positive? I mean, obviously, it's a whole new realm. During the height of the pandemic, you sort of weren't allowed to meet people unless you were already in an intimate relationship to have sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so porn, or, internet interactions became the way that people really dealt with sex. It was like a whole new universe. And so where once porn, you could say, well, why do porn? Or people could put it entirely in negative terms. That seemed to be too one-sided, and the pandemic brought that out. So in a way, is that a foundation for trying to talk about moderation in the use of porn? Does that give it a little bit better of a landscape for removing it from a strictly addictive standpoint?
Right. So if you can think about reasons why pornography has its positive aspect. I mean, it has to have some positive, or else why engage in it in the first place? And this is a person who's generally social, global pandemics aside, and works seeks is single now, but seeks relationships, is active, is used to actively dating, but was stuck at home with access to the internet and not a lot to think about, what he wanted to do. And that is something that we talked about. So what are the positives? And well, the positives are, first of all, it's something to do. There are things that he craved in intimacy, and he got a proxy for that out of pornography. And now as things open up, he's thinking, well, I'm not exactly sure what the world is supposed to be like now, but there's attached to all this is sort of a dormant prowess that he has for interacting with people that he never really had to think about before. Now he's trying to piece together, well, what is the best way to meet people? How comfortable are they with meeting another person or being out in public now? How do I get back on my feet and introduce myself? I feel sort of antisocial more than I have been lately. I'm just now getting back to work. And this is a young person, I'll say young 20s. And I'm thinking, if you're in your young 20s and are not able to socialize as the way that you normally have, or not able to look for intimacy the way that was normal for you, I almost can't imagine not resorting to something like pornography or some sort of a proxy for getting all of those things. And I just want to say, he and I have already talked about this, but I just want to
you want to decriminalize it. First, you decriminalize it, and then you demoralize it,
right,
and then you de-disease it.
Right. I kind of want to just give some encouragement that I can imagine being in that position. And if I were in that position, I wouldn't be scared that I'd be tethered to it for forever. But I would be thinking, what is it that I want? And you can get a clue about what you want from the reasons why you engage in pornography in the first place. When and where, how has it become too much? How is it, detracted from your ability to sort of do other things that you want to do? What are those things that you want to do? How do you do those? What are the next steps? That's really that's the 5-year-old could have sort of answered this question in a way.
5-year-old, right. It's a positive thing that you experience is pleasurable, but the 5-year-old knows if you go too far down that track, you get yourself into trouble and you can't do other functional things like gymnastics. So
there are two things at play here. One is, how do you reorganize life so that you can feel productive and in your current circumstance? So you relied on pornography, but now let's just say nothing else opened up and there were no alternatives to being at home. What are some of the things that you can do to reorganize? And on the other hand, the good news is that things are opening up. People can be more social. So you've got that whole network to plug into whenever he's ready and however he wants to take those steps and channel outward. So, I'm relatively certain a really young person in this circumstance who's still looking for deciding what he wants to do in life is going to be okay. I wouldn't probably, go ahead.
You wouldn't send him away to a porn addiction rehab.
Right. And I'm not besmirching or trying to minimize the significance of the impact that it's had on him. It's clearly been really hard. I have a question for you though. This also came up. I thought this was interesting because I haven't really thought about it in these terms. He's mentioning that, well, he wants to feel good about himself, and pornography is not exactly a noble endeavor. And he almost feels like if he had a drug addiction, he'd have more people to talk to at this point. And, it might be idiosyncratic, but he's feeling like because it's pornography, it's almost like he's worried that you bring that up to somebody in casual conversation, you're a creep or something.
I agree with him 100%. I mean, it's sort of okay in society now to say, oh, I was addicted to painkillers. That's sort of like a conversation starter. But, are you really going to go to a gathering or a party and say, oh, I was addicted to porn? I mean, I see his point exactly. And and there are people who regard porn, as we were just saying, in totally negative context. And so, putting it like other areas, I mean, sex is the last. I mean, we're able to talk about drugs and alcohol, even with children, before we're able to talk about sex and porn and masturbation. It's sort of the last horizon. So, obviously, I think you have a gift at relaxing a person around something like that and saying, well, let's just say you're not the only client I have with this issue.
Hmm.
In fact, if you look at the data on popular internet sites, it's the number one thing in the world almost. So, welcome to join the crowd.
Yeah. All
By
right.
the way, so speaking about your ability your appeal around the globe, we've talked about your role within the family, your role talking to 5-year-olds, your role in defusing somebody dealing with a porn addiction. You're being recruited by a foreign power. A foreign power, I mean somebody not in Vermont, to participate in a statewide deliberation about everything, about, what everybody's worried about, more than even the porn addiction now. Do you want to cautiously describe your potential employment, without revealing who this is?
Yeah. So we'll just say it's in a different state. And I got into this because people who know me, who are advocates for people in chronic pain who are not being adequately treated for their pain because of the hypersensitivity or hyperfocus on limiting pain medicine prescriptions, they thought that I would be a good person to try to undo some of this conflict or make sense of this conflict. What's happened is, just in a nutshell, in a state that's a conservative state, two things are happening. One, pain patients are not adequately, they're not even, they're just being ignored. Their pain's being ignored because they're not able to get pain meds, but also nobody's looking at their quality of life. They're saying, well, you don't need pain meds. You can do these things, like you can do yoga or whatever they say. Not that that's a horrible thing. The horrible thing is that they're not engaging with their patients, trying to figure out what it is getting in the way. And so the impairment and distress in a lot of these patients' lives is the pain itself. If they could just get that under control, they don't care how it's getting under control. It could be a medication, it could be a surgery, it could be a new lifestyle change. If they could figure out, each one of them, how to manage that, they're saying my life will be okay. Like whatever it is, that I could take a pill every day, and as long as it's managing my pain, I'll be okay. And so the hesitancy, of course, was nationwide per the CDC's recommendations that a good target would be limiting prescribing. Well, this state has come to they've changed things a little bit. They're trying to relax that regulation so that people could be adequately prescribed even opioid pain medications. But they feel as the problem, they feel as though they need to pick up the slack with regulations somewhere else if they're going to be doing that. So it's almost like, well, we can't just say we'll relax prescribing regulations because between you and me, we got to kind of stick with the story about, drugs cause addiction. So what they're doing is they want more relaxed prescribing, more people to get pain medications. And don't ask me how they do this logic. They want to shut down some of the local methadone clinics. One of the reasons being a lot of those pain patients were turning to methadone and saying, just label me addicted. Just say I have a substance use disorder and then I can get the methadone, because that's some of the regulation on prescribing it.
That's obviously a pretty good way to go. We're driving people into the addiction box.
Right. And so at the same time, on one side of their mouths, they're saying, well, we need to be able to give people adequate care. On the other side, they're saying we should probably, this seems like nefarious that people are going to these, it's supposed to be for addiction, and pain patients are going and they don't seem to be working out. We're just giving more pain pills to people who are addicted. and that doesn't seem to be working. The reason I thought to bring this up is because, first of all, the question to me is, well, how do we help them make sense of this? How do we help legislators understand that people who have addictions, they need quality of life sort of care the same way that pain patients need quality of life sort of care? So why do they feel like they have to sort of play this balancing act? You know, you screw one over and in favor of the other. We'll have, you and I will agree on a lot of it. The other reason I wanted to bring it up is because they are against, it seems like generally against methadone or substitution drugs for completely different reasons than we would not be in favor of the whole concept of substitution drugs. We are not in.
Talk about in a subsequent podcast to this one.
Right. So I think that it's fair to say, you can stop me if I'm not accurate, but I think it would be fair to say that you and I are concerned with the idea and the systematizing of prescribing drugs. The story that if a person gets a drug, well, that's the best we can do. We can medicate them, and then they can just stay in the system, and they'll just come back and they'll come get their dose. And as long as they stick with it, they can be basically okay, but it's probably the best that they'll get, and it'll save all of their lives. When at the same time, we see that obviously it's not, something's going on where the death rate is surpassing the amount of medication that we're giving people. You can make any argument about that you want, but you can say that it is helping save lives, but the death rates are skyrocketing despite it. Still, we're left with that problem. There must be something else we have to do. But these legislators aren't thinking about it that way. They're just sort of like, what's her name from New Jersey, who didn't want to put in a needle exchange because she thought it would look bad for her politically.
Governor Christine Whitman.
Yes. Christine Whitman, yeah. It's similar. They're kind of saying they're not using logic. What they're doing is they're trying to save face politically by saying, right, don't worry, we are hard on this kind of, enabling people. We just want to make sure the pain patients are getting their prescriptions. But don't worry, we'll shut this down.
It comes from having preconceived. What we're talking about is, well, let's just dial down like the 5-year-old to the basic question of what's going to enable this person. There are two aspects of it, a substance use disorder, their impairment and distress. What can we do to minimize the impairment and minimize the distress? And let's look at the whole panoply of things that we can use. For some reason, I was on a plane returning from England, and I was in business class, and I was near a guy who was a provider of a main non-medicated pain relief clinic in a very high death rate area. And his whole argument was we need to eliminate painkillers entirely. And so we're doing, meditation and visualization and yoga and exercise. And so our reaction would be what you said. Well, that's all great. I mean, we're not against yoga. We're for those things. But in this really high death rate area, how many people are you actually going to reach with all of that? And I said, well, how many clients do you have at your clinic? And they have 20. And so, well, that's great. I don't know if these are more upscale and they have more time. Not everybody's going to come and do yoga, how 3 times a week. And I said, well, that doesn't eliminate the need for painkillers. He was against painkillers. He was a physician. And I'm saying, well, painkillers have a role, and we want to make them available to people at the same time that we don't want them to become, we're against addiction, but we're not against painkillers. We're certainly not against alternative pain relief methods. That's what we're talking about. Non-chemical, non-drug pain relief methods. We're 100% for them, but we're not going to eliminate painkillers using those things. That's why painkillers were invented and why they're so popular, is because they're effective medications for what they do. So it's a complex balancing act. Back to the 5-year-old, And every effort to kind of short circuit that by saying, well, let's just rely on medications. Um, that's the only people who believe that methadone is the only way to deal with the drug heroin addiction. We reject that point of view, and then we reject the point of view at the totally opposite end of the spectrum, which is, well, let's not rely on drugs at all. That can only be a negative thing. And the complication that we're going to get into is, what is harm reduction? What is mix? And we also discussed, you and I, Bob Weir, who had a long time painkiller, whatever, addiction, and the excessive alcohol use. He's about my age, 70 or 70-ish, and he's going to herbal teas, and he doesn't drink like he used to, but he still drinks wine, and he uses, he's doing exercises and, chamomile tea, but every once in a while he still needs a painkiller because he's older, and he's got those gnarled fingers from playing a guitar for decades, for 50 years. I think they picked him up when he was like 18 or something off the streets of San Francisco. So I don't know, that's 74, whatever, it's more than half a century. And you develop some pain over, all those years. So the hardest thing is to create a balance and not be committed to just relying on one dictum versus another. Oh, no drugs. Oh, only drugs.
I'll leave this open-ended, but I'll also just close the whole thing here before we go on to our next segment. I've asked questions now. I already had suspicions, and I've asked questions and asked different people what's going on in this situation that I'm being asked to try to parse or make sense of. And it's the Kathy Bates quote from Fried Green Tomatoes, where she says, I'm older and I have better insurance. It's the people who are pressing the legislators right now are older and they have better insurance. They have stability in their lives already, except for this pain. They are part of the electorate that can really apply pressure. And the Republican legislature they're not making this change because this is my thoughts. They're not making this change because they think, oh, well, these people seem really burdened and we want to do what's best for everybody. So like Bob Weir, we should let them be adults who have the capacity of making decisions, choosing from a buffet of life options and putting them together as they see fit. They're thinking we need to do something good for optics always because there's going to be another election year in next year or 2 years. The fundamental problems that really need to be solved to put everybody in a better place will probably transcend our careers. So it's not very motivating to start solving those problems and then retire with there still being problems in place. So, who are the people who can't advocate for themselves? And I don't think it's this direct, but people with addictions tend to have more trouble advocating for themselves when they're in that class of people who maybe don't have insurance or they're getting Medicaid and they're living on the streets. And so these are the population that they kind of don't mind going after in order to look okay politically.
You have to use your greatest skills. I think it's going to be a challenge because I know you were part of your county task force, that you're going to have to convey these ideas to people that, there's no downside to them. Christine Whitman, after refusing to do needle exchange, got reelected.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Now she spoke, and she's viewed as a great Republican. She spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Nobody looks at the fact that thousands of people died because it was a political no loser for her. And so you're going to have to use your greatest gifts. I know you have it, to explain the inner workings of this and why it's a good thing and the right thing and helpful to people, while enabling them to supersede their purely political and public considerations.
When we talked to Pat Denning, which is one of our first episodes on this podcast that I rebroadcasted, you were asking her about, well, so what do you say to people who are who push against harm reduction, who worry that, well, I as a clinician, I don't want to be seen as causing more problems or somebody dying under my auspices or ever saying that it's okay to use a drug or that it's not a bad thing. And she answered something that I think you would answer too. Like, this person had their problems before they came to me. I'm not making them do one thing or another. They're already doing it. I'm trying to figure out how can you live your lifestyle in a safer way or in a way that you feel like you're making some progress. That sort of mindset is where I think these people are politically. They're saying, except opposite, they're saying, well, these problems are already occurring. And I know that playing it safe means that I can kind of let the problems continue occurring as long as I'm doing a nice looking thing, and I'll probably get reelected. They could switch that. They could say these problems are already occurring and, I might not solve them, but I can at least improve on the problems, and I can shine a light on the improvements that I'm making and explain, how I'm lifting up the community in some ways that might not be tangible unless I shine the light on it. But anyway, that's the motivation I'm looking for.
Zach, addiction political consultant. I don't know that that exists yet.
Yeah, well, all my jobs don't exist, so maybe I'll make a new one.
How to do harm reduction. So our next our brother podcast to this one is going to be on the evolution of harm reduction, and you'll let people know how they can tune into that one then.
Yeah, let's end this one now. I'll say happy Sunday to everybody, and I will have at the end of this video, there'll be a little thumbnail video that you can click to listen to our part 2 on harm reduction, which will be on your channel. So thank you, Stanton. We'll talk to you soon.